There was a small orphanage at the edge of a quiet town where nobody ever seemed to visit. The paint on the walls was peeling. The playground outside had rusty swings that creaked in the wind, and inside, there lived a little girl who had stopped believing in miracles a long time ago. Her name was Mila. She was 10 years old, with big brown eyes that always seemed to be looking at something far away, something nobody else could see. Mila had come to the orphanage when she was just 3 years old. She barely remembered her parents anymore. Sometimes, late at night, she would close her eyes and try to picture her mother's face. But the image was always blurry, like looking through a foggy window. All she had left of them was a small photograph that she kept hidden under her pillow. In the picture, her mother was smiling and holding baby Mila in her arms. Her father stood beside them, his hand resting gently on her mother's shoulder. They had died in a car accident. That's what the orphanage director, Mrs. Holloway, had told her when she was old enough to understand. One rainy night, a truck lost control on a slippery road, and just like that, Mila's whole world disappeared. For 7 years, Mila had watched other children get adopted. Couples would come to the orphanage with hopeful smiles. They would walk through the rooms, looking at the children like they were choosing flowers from a garden, and every single time, they would pick someone else. The younger kids always went first. The ones with bright smiles and loud laughs. The ones who ran up to visitors and tugged at their sleeves, begging to be noticed. Mila was not like them. She was quiet, too quiet, some people said. She never ran up to anyone. She never begged for attention. Instead, she would sit by the window in the corner of the common room, watching the clouds drift across the sky. The other children had a nickname for her. They called her the Ghost. Not because they were being mean, but because Mila moved through the orphanage like a shadow. She was there, but somehow, she was also invisible. Mrs. Holloway worried about her. She would often sit beside Mila and ask her how she was feeling. Mila would always give the same answer. She would shrug her thin shoulders and whisper that she was fine, but Mrs. Holloway knew better. She could see the loneliness in the little girl's eyes. A loneliness so deep that it made her heart ache. There was one thing that seemed to bring Mila a small bit of peace. In the dusty recreation room at the back of the orphanage, there was an old piano. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Some of the keys were broken. The wood was scratched and faded, and it hadn't been tuned in years. But Mila loved it. She didn't know how to play. Not really. She had never had a single lesson in her life. But sometimes, when no one was watching, she would sneak into the recreation room and sit on the creaky piano bench. She would press the keys one by one, listening to the sounds they made. Some notes were bright and clear. Others were dull and flat, but to Mila, it didn't matter. When she touched those keys, she felt something she couldn't explain. It was like the piano understood her. Like it was the only friend she had in the whole world. One cold afternoon in October, everything changed. A black car pulled up to the orphanage. It was shiny and expensive, the kind of car that looked out of place on the dusty road leading to the old building. The children rushed to the windows to see who had arrived. A man stepped out of the car. He was tall, with gray hair and a serious face. He wore a long, dark coat and walked with the kind of confidence that made people notice him. His name was Vincent Hartwell, and he was one of the most successful music producers in the country. But Vincent wasn't famous just for his money or his success. He was known for something else. 5 years ago, he had lost his wife and daughter in a tragic accident. A fire had broken out in their home while he was away on a business trip. By the time he got there, it was too late. His whole family was gone. After that, Vincent had shut himself off from the world. He stopped working. He stopped seeing friends. He spent his days alone in his big, empty house, surrounded by memories of the people he had lost. But something had changed recently. Something inside him had shifted. He wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the loneliness. Maybe it was the silence that had become too loud to bear. Whatever it was, it had brought him here, to this small orphanage at the edge of a quiet town, Mrs. Holloway greeted him at the door with a warm smile. She led him inside and offered him a cup of tea. The children gathered in the common room, whispering and giggling with excitement. It had been months since anyone had come to adopt. Vincent sat in a chair near the window, his eyes scanning the room. The children tried their best to impress him. Some showed off their drawings. Others told jokes or did little dances. They all wanted to be noticed. They all wanted to be chosen. But Vincent didn't seem interested. His face remained serious, almost sad. He watched the children with distant eyes, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. Then, after a long silence, he spoke. His voice was deep and calm. He told Mrs. Holloway that he wanted to adopt a child, but he had one condition. One unusual, unexpected condition that made everyone in the room freeze. He said that he would adopt any child in this orphanage, but only if they could learn to play one complete song on the piano within 30 days. The room went silent. The children looked at each other with wide eyes. Some of them had never even touched a piano before. Others had tried a few times but gave up quickly. Learning to play a real song in just 30 days seemed impossible. Mrs. Holloway frowned slightly. She wanted to ask why. Why such a strange condition? What did playing piano have to do with adoption? But something in Vincent's eyes stopped her. There was pain there, deep, hidden pain. She decided not to push. The children began to whisper excitedly. This was their chance. A real chance to finally have a family. A few of them immediately ran toward the recreation room, eager to start practicing. But Mila didn't move. She stayed by the window, her small hands folded in her lap. Her heart was pounding, but her face showed nothing. She had heard what the man said. She understood the challenge, but unlike the other children, she felt no excitement, only fear. She had never had a music lesson. She couldn't read notes. She didn't even know where to place her fingers on the keys. How could she possibly learn to play a whole song in 30 days? The other kids had already started fighting over who would practice first. Their voices filled the hallway, loud and eager. Mila turned her head and looked out the window. The sky was gray and heavy with clouds. A single bird sat on the branch of a bare tree, looking just as lonely as she felt. She whispered to herself so quietly that no one else could hear. Why would this time be any different? And deep inside her chest, a small piece of hope that she didn't even know existed began to crack. The next few days at the orphanage were nothing like before. The quiet halls were now filled with noise. The sound of piano keys being pressed echoed through the building from morning until night. Every child wanted to prove they could do it. Every child wanted to be the one Vincent Hartwell would choose. A volunteer music teacher named Mr. Bennett started coming twice a week to help. He was a kind old man with round glasses and a gentle voice. He would sit with the children one by one, showing them how to place their fingers on the keys. He taught them simple melodies and encouraged them to keep trying even when they made mistakes. Some of the kids picked it up quickly. A boy named Daniel, who was 12 years old and always talked the loudest, seemed to be the best. He had long fingers and a natural sense of rhythm. After just a few days, he could already play a short tune without looking at the keys. The other children watched him with envy. The staff whispered that he would probably be the one to get adopted, but Mila stayed far away from all of it. She would stand in the doorway of the recreation room, watching the others practice. Her eyes followed their fingers as they moved across the piano. She listened to the notes, some beautiful and some clumsy, but she never stepped inside. She never asked for a turn. The other kids didn't seem to notice her. They were too busy competing with each other, too busy dreaming about what it would be like to finally have a home. One evening, after everyone had gone to bed, Mrs. Holloway was walking through the hallway when she heard a sound. It was soft, almost like a whisper. She followed it to the recreation room and pushed the door open slowly. There, sitting alone on the piano bench, was Mila. The little girl didn't notice Mrs. Holloway at first. Her small fingers were resting on the keys, but she wasn't playing. She was just sitting there, staring at the piano with tears rolling down her cheeks. Mrs. Holloway felt her heart tighten. She walked over quietly and sat down beside Mila on the bench. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The room was dark except for the pale moonlight coming through the window. Then Mila spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She said she didn't know why she even came here. She said she couldn't play. She had never learned. She didn't know how to read music or where to put her fingers. The other kids were so much better than her. They had been practicing for days, and she hadn't even started. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and said the words that broke Mrs. Holloway's heart. Nobody ever picks me. Why would this time be any different? Mrs. Holloway was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the little girl beside her, so small and so lost. She thought about all the years Mila had spent in this orphanage, watching other children leave while she stayed behind. She thought about the loneliness that lived in those big brown eyes. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out something she had been keeping for a very long time. It was a small book. The cover was worn and faded, the pages yellow with age. On the front, in simple letters, it said, "Beginner Piano Songs." Mrs. Holloway placed the book gently in Mila's hands. She told her that this book once belonged to someone very special. Someone who also felt like she wasn't good enough, but that person learned to play anyway. Not because she was talented, but because she didn't give up. Mila looked down at the book. Her fingers traced the edges of the cover. She opened it slowly and saw pages filled with musical notes and simple instructions. Mrs. Holloway put a hand on her shoulder and said something Mila would never forget. "You'll never know what you're capable of unless you try, sweetheart. And even if you don't win, at least you'll know you gave it everything you had." Then she stood up and walked to the door. Before she left, she looked back at Mila and smiled softly. "The recreation room is empty every night after 10. No one will bother you there." And with that, she was gone. Mila sat alone in the darkness, holding the book to her chest. Her heart was beating fast. She was scared. More scared than she had ever been. But somewhere deep inside her, something else was stirring, something that felt a little bit like hope. That night, Mila made a decision. She waited until the clock struck midnight. Then she slipped out of her bed and tiptoed down the hallway. The orphanage was silent. Everyone was asleep. The only sound was the creaking of the old wooden floors beneath her feet. She pushed open the door to the recreation room and stepped inside. The piano sat in the corner, waiting for her like an old friend. Mila sat down on the bench and opened the book Mrs. Holloway had given her. She turned to the first page and saw a song she recognized. "Somewhere Over the Rainbow." She had heard it once in a movie the children watched together. The melody was simple and beautiful, full of longing and dreams. She placed her fingers on the keys the way the book showed. Her hands were shaking. She pressed the first note. It sounded wrong. Too loud. Too harsh. She tried again. This time, she pressed too softly, and the note barely made a sound. She took a deep breath and tried once more. And again. And again. For hours, Mila sat at that piano, struggling through each note. Her fingers ached. Her eyes burned from staring at the tiny print in the dim light. But she didn't stop. She whispered the notes to herself like a prayer. Do. Re. Mi. Fa. Sol. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the window, she had learned only the first few notes of the song. It wasn't much, but it was something. She closed the book, crept back to her room, and fell asleep with a tiny smile on her face. Every night after that, Mila did the same thing. She waited until everyone was asleep, then snuck into the recreation room to practice. Night after night, she sat at that old broken piano, teaching herself to play one note at a time. Some nights were harder than others. Some nights, she wanted to give up. Her fingers would slip, and she would play the wrong note over and over. She would bury her face in her hands and cry silently in the dark. But then, she would remember Mrs. Holloway's words. You'll never know unless you try. And she would start again. 2 weeks passed. Vincent Hartwell returned to the orphanage for a progress check. The children gathered in the common room, eager to show off what they had learned. Daniel played his song with confidence, his fingers dancing across the keys. The staff clapped and smiled. Vincent nodded slowly, his face unreadable. One by one, the other children took their turns. Some did well. Others stumbled and made mistakes. But they all tried. When it was over, Vincent stood up and began walking through the room. He stopped in front of each child, asking them questions about their practice. His voice was calm but serious. Then he noticed Mila. She was sitting alone in the corner, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't performed. She hadn't even come near the piano. Vincent walked over to her. He knelt down so that his eyes were level with hers. He asked her if she had been practicing. Mila's heart pounded in her chest. She thought about all those nights alone in the dark, all those hours spent teaching herself to play. She wanted to tell him the truth. She wanted to show him how hard she had been working, but fear gripped her throat. She looked into his serious eyes and felt small. So small. She shook her head and whispered, "No, sir, I can't play." Vincent stared at her for a long moment. His expression didn't change. Then, without a word, he stood up and walked away. Mila watched him go, her heart sinking like a stone. That night, she lay in bed, unable to sleep. She heard two of the staff members talking in the hallway. Their voices were low, but she could hear every word. "Mr. Hartwell already knows who he wants. That boy Daniel is the clear favorite. The quiet girl doesn't stand a chance." Mila pulled her blanket over her head and cried into her pillow. Maybe they were right. Maybe she never had a chance at all. The days that followed were the hardest of Mila's life. She continued her secret practice every night. But something had changed inside her. The hope that had started to grow was now fading. Every time she sat at the piano, she heard those words echoing in her head. The quiet girl doesn't stand a chance. Her fingers still moved across the keys. She still whispered the notes to herself in the darkness. But her heart wasn't in it anymore. What was the point? Daniel was better than her. Everyone knew it. Even the staff knew it. She was just fooling herself. With only 10 days left before the final performance, Mila's hands began to show the cost of her struggle. Small blisters had formed on her fingertips from pressing the old, stiff keys, night after night. The skin was red and raw. It hurt to even hold a pencil during the day. She hid her hands in her pockets so no one would see. She didn't want anyone to know she had been trying. If she failed, at least no one would know how hard she had worked. At least no one could laugh at her for believing she had a chance. One afternoon, Mila was sitting alone in the corner of the common room, staring out the window like she always did. The other children were playing and laughing. Daniel was sitting on a chair near the bookshelf, surrounded by a group of younger kids who looked up to him like he was already a hero. He noticed Mila watching and smirked. He stood up and walked over to her, his hands in his pockets. The other kids followed, curious to see what would happen. Daniel stopped right in front of her and tilted his head. His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Why are you even still here? You didn't even play during the progress check. You told Mr. Hartwell you can't play, so why bother?" Mila didn't answer. She kept her eyes on the floor. Daniel laughed and shook his head. He leaned closer and lowered his voice, but it was still sharp enough to cut. "He wants someone talented. Someone who can actually do something. Not some quiet little mouse who sits in the corner all day. You're wasting your time." The other children giggled. A few of them whispered to each other, glancing at Mila with pity in their eyes. Mila felt her face burn. Her chest tightened. She wanted to say something. She wanted to stand up and tell him he was wrong. But the words wouldn't come. They never did. Instead, she stood up quickly and ran out of the room. She didn't stop until she reached her small bedroom. She threw herself onto the bed and buried her face in the pillow. The tears came fast and hot, soaking through the fabric. She cried for a long time. She cried for all the years she had spent being invisible. She cried for all the families who had looked right past her. She cried for the parents she barely remembered and the life she never got to have. And she cried because maybe Daniel was right. Maybe she was just a quiet little mouse. Maybe she would never be anything more. That night, Mila didn't go to practice. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling emptier than she had ever felt. The music book Mrs. Holloway had given her sat on the small table beside her bed. She couldn't even look at it. Eventually, her eyes grew heavy, and she drifted into a restless sleep. And then she had a dream. She was standing in a room filled with soft golden light. There was a piano in the center, shiny and beautiful, not old and broken like the one at the orphanage. And sitting at the piano was a woman. The woman turned around, and Mila's heart stopped. It was her mother. She looked exactly like the photograph Mila kept under her pillow. The same warm smile, the same gentle eyes. She was wearing a white dress, and her hair fell softly around her shoulders. Her mother didn't say anything. She just smiled and patted the space beside her on the piano bench. Mila walked over slowly, her legs trembling. She sat down next to her mother, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful, safe, like nothing bad had ever happened. Her mother placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The melody was soft and sweet, like a lullaby. Mila recognized it instantly. It was Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Mila watched her mother's fingers move gracefully across the keys. She wanted to stay in this moment forever. She wanted to reach out and hold her mother's hand and never let go, but then her mother stopped playing. She turned to Mila and looked into her eyes. And even though she didn't speak, Mila understood exactly what she was saying. Don't give up. Mila woke with a start. Her face was wet with tears. The room was dark and silent. For a moment, she didn't move. She just lay there, breathing hard, feeling the echo of her mother's presence slowly fade. But something was different now. The emptiness that had filled her chest was still there. The fear was still there. But alongside it, there was something else. Something stronger. She sat up in bed and looked at the music book on the table. She picked it up and held it close to her heart. She whispered to herself in the darkness, "I'm not playing to get adopted. I'm playing for me. I'm playing for you, Mom." That night, Mila went back to the recreation room. Her fingers still hurt. Her heart still ached. But she played anyway. She played through the pain. She played through the doubt. She played until the first light of morning crept through the window. And she didn't stop. What Mila didn't know was that she wasn't as alone as she thought. On several nights over the past 2 weeks, a black car had parked quietly on the street outside the orphanage. And inside that car sat Vincent Hartwell. He couldn't sleep most nights. The memories of his wife and daughter haunted him. So he would drive, sometimes for hours. And somehow, he always ended up here. One night, he had noticed a faint light in the recreation room window. Curious, he had stepped out of his car and walked closer. Through the dusty glass, he saw a small figure sitting at the piano. It was Mila. He watched her press the keys slowly, one by one. He saw her make mistakes. He saw her stop, take a breath, and start again. He saw her wipe her eyes and keep going. Night after night, he came back. And night after night, he watched her. He saw a little girl who had no teacher, no help, and no reason to believe she could succeed. But she kept trying anyway. She kept fighting. She kept playing, and something inside Vincent began to shift. He thought about his daughter. She had loved the piano too. She used to play every night before bed. She wasn't the most talented player, but she had heart. She played because she loved it, because it made her feel alive. Watching Mila, Vincent saw that same spirit, that same quiet fire. He never told anyone what he had seen. He never let Mila know he was watching. But in his heart, something had already changed. The final day arrived. All the children gathered in the recreation room for their performances. The piano had been polished for the occasion. Chairs were set up in rows. Mrs. Holloway and the staff sat in the back, watching nervously. Vincent Hartwell sat in the front row, his face calm and unreadable. He wore the same dark coat he had worn the first day he arrived. One by one, the children performed. Daniel went first and played his song perfectly. His fingers moved with confidence. When he finished, he looked at Vincent with a proud smile. The other children followed. Some played well. Others stumbled, but they all gave it their best. Finally, there was only one child left. Mila. Mrs. Holloway called her name softly. The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at the small girl sitting in the back corner. Mila's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her legs felt weak. Her hands were shaking. She stood up slowly and walked toward the piano. Each step felt like it took forever. She could feel everyone's eyes on her. She could hear Daniel whisper something to the boy next to him. She sat down on the bench and placed her trembling fingers on the keys. The room was completely silent. Mila closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought about her mother. She thought about the dream. She thought about all those nights alone in the dark. And then she began to play. Mila's fingers hovered over the keys. The whole room was watching her. She could feel their eyes like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. For a moment, she couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Every fear she had ever felt came rushing back at once. The voice in her head whispered that she wasn't good enough, that she would fail, that everyone would laugh at her. She glanced up and saw Daniel sitting in the second row. He had a small smirk on his face, like he already knew what was going to happen, like he was waiting for her to mess up. Mila looked back down at the piano. Her vision blurred with tears she was trying hard to hold back. Then she did something she had done every night in that dark recreation room. She closed her eyes, and she thought about her mother. She pictured the dream, the golden light, the beautiful piano, her mother's gentle smile. She remembered the feeling of sitting beside her, safe and loved. Even if it was only for a moment, she whispered so quietly that no one could hear, "This is for you, Mom." And then she pressed the first key. The note rang out, clear and soft. It filled the silent room like a single drop of rain falling into still water. Mila pressed the next key. And the next. Her fingers moved slowly at first, unsure and trembling. The melody was shaky. One of the notes came out a little flat. She almost stopped, but she didn't. She kept going. She let the music guide her. She stopped thinking about the people watching. She stopped worrying about making mistakes. She just played, somewhere over the rainbow. Way up high, the melody began to flow more smoothly. Her fingers found their rhythm. The notes connected one after another, forming the song she had practiced so many times in the darkness. It wasn't perfect. She missed a note here and there. Her timing was a little off in some places. But there was something in the way she played that made everyone in the room go still. It was feeling, pure, raw feeling. Every note carried the weight of her loneliness. Every pause held the ache of all those years spent waiting and hoping. The music didn't just come from her fingers. It came from somewhere deep inside her heart. Mrs. Holloway sat in the back row with her hand pressed over her mouth. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She had watched Mila grow up in this orphanage. She had seen her sit alone by the window day after day, year after year. And now, hearing her play, she finally understood just how much that little girl had been holding inside. The other staff members were crying too. Even some of the children had gone quiet, their teasing and whispers forgotten. Daniel's smirk had disappeared. He stared at Mila with wide eyes, like he was seeing her for the first time. But the most powerful reaction came from the man sitting in the front row. Vincent Hartwell had not moved since Mila started playing. His hands were folded tightly in his lap. His jaw was clenched. His eyes were fixed on the small girl at the piano. At first, his face showed nothing. It was the same serious, unreadable expression he always wore. But as the melody continued, something changed. His shoulders began to tremble. His grip on his own hands tightened until his knuckles turned white. And then, slowly, a single tear rolled down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just sat there, letting it fall. Because he knew this song. He knew it better than anyone. It was the song his daughter used to play every night before she went to sleep. She would sit at the piano in their living room, her small fingers moving carefully over the keys, and she would play this exact melody. Somewhere over the rainbow. It had been her favorite. After the fire took her away, Vincent couldn't bear to hear the song anymore. He had avoided it for 5 years. He changed the radio station whenever it came on. He left rooms when someone started humming it. The pain was too much. But now, sitting in this old orphanage, listening to a little girl who had nothing and no one play the same song with all her heart, Vincent felt something crack open inside him. The wall he had built around his heart began to crumble. Mila played the final notes of the song. Her fingers lingered on the last key for a moment, letting the sound fade into silence. Then she opened her eyes. The room was completely still. No one clapped. No one moved. The silence was so deep that Mila could hear her own heartbeat. She looked out at the audience, and her stomach dropped. Everyone was staring at her. Some had tears in their eyes. Others looked stunned, like they had just witnessed something they couldn't explain. Mila's chest tightened. She thought she had failed. She thought the silence meant she had done something wrong. She lowered her head and started to stand up, ready to walk away in shame. But then she heard footsteps. She looked up and saw Vincent Hartwell walking toward her. His face was wet with tears. His eyes, which had always seemed so cold and distant, were now filled with something warm, something tender. He stopped in front of the piano and looked down at her. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. He just studied her face, like he was searching for something. Then he knelt down so that his eyes were level with hers. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. That song, that was my daughter's favorite song. She used to play it every single night. Mila didn't know what to say. She just stared at him, her heart pounding. Vincent continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't come here looking for the most talented child. I didn't come here to find a perfect musician. I came here to find someone with heart, someone who plays because they feel it, not because they want to impress anyone. He paused and took a shaky breath. And you, little one, you have more heart than anyone I have ever met. Mila felt tears spill down her cheeks. She couldn't hold them back anymore. No one had ever said anything like that to her. No one had ever looked at her the way Vincent was looking at her now. Then Vincent reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out something small. It was an old photograph, worn around the edges and faded with time. He held it out to Mila. She took it with trembling hands and looked at the image. It showed a young girl, maybe a few years older than Mila, sitting at a beautiful piano. She had a bright smile and kind eyes, and in her hands, she was holding a book. Mila's breath caught in her throat. It was the same book. The exact same beginner's music book that Mrs. Holloway had given her. She looked up at Vincent, her eyes wide with shock. Vincent nodded slowly, tears still streaming down his face. That book belonged to my daughter. Her name was Lily. After she passed, my wife donated it to this orphanage. We didn't know if anyone would ever use it. We just hoped that someday it might help another child the way it helped her. He reached out and gently placed his hand over Mila's. I never knew the book ended up here. I never knew someone was using it. Until I saw you. I watched you practice through that window, night after night. I saw you struggle. I saw you cry. And I saw you get back up and try again. His voice broke as he spoke the next words. You reminded me of her. You reminded me of my Lily. Mila couldn't speak. Her whole body was shaking. The tears fell freely now, dripping onto the photograph in her hands. Mrs. Holloway stood up from her seat, her own face streaked with tears. The other children sat in stunned silence. Even Daniel had nothing to say. Vincent looked into Mila's eyes and smiled for the first time since he had arrived at the orphanage. It was a sad smile, full of grief and loss, but it was also full of something else, hope. He squeezed her hand gently and asked her a question that would change her life forever. Mila, would you like to come home with me? Mila couldn't believe what she had just heard. She stared at Vincent, her eyes wide and filled with tears. Her heart was beating so fast she thought it might burst out of her chest. For a moment, she wondered if she was dreaming again. Maybe she was still asleep in her small bed at the orphanage, and this was all just another dream that would disappear when she opened her eyes. But the warmth of Vincent's hand on hers felt real. The tears on his face were real. The photograph of his daughter that she held in her trembling fingers was real. This was actually happening. Vincent waited patiently for her answer. He didn't rush her. He didn't pressure her. He just looked at her with those kind, gentle eyes that had once seemed so cold and distant. Mila opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her throat was too tight. Her emotions were too big. She had spent so many years dreaming of this moment. So many years watching other children leave while she stayed behind. So many years believing that no one would ever want her. And now, here was this man, kneeling in front of her, asking her to be part of his family. She tried again to speak. Her voice came out as a whisper, broken and shaky. "You really want me?" Vincent smiled through his tears. It was the most genuine smile Mila had ever seen. He nodded and said yes. He said he had never been more sure of anything in his life. Mila let out a sob. She couldn't hold it back anymore. All the pain, all the loneliness, all the years of waiting came pouring out of her in that single moment. She threw her arms around Vincent's neck and held on like she would never let go. Vincent wrapped his arms around her small body and held her close. He closed his eyes and felt something he hadn't felt in 5 long years. Peace. The room erupted in emotion. Mrs. Holloway was crying so hard she could barely stand. The staff members hugged each other, wiping their eyes. Even some of the children were sniffling, touched by what they had just witnessed. Daniel sat frozen in his chair. His eyes were red, and for the first time, there was no arrogance on his face. Only something that looked like regret. He had spent weeks mocking Mila, calling her names, telling her she didn't stand a chance. And now he realized how wrong he had been. He lowered his head and said nothing. The next few weeks passed like a beautiful dream. Vincent worked with Mrs. Holloway and the adoption agency to complete all the paperwork. There were meetings and interviews and home visits. It was a long process, but Vincent was patient. He had waited 5 years to feel whole again. He could wait a little longer. During that time, he visited Mila at the orphanage every single day. He brought her books about music. He told her stories about his daughter Lily and how much she had loved the piano. He showed her pictures of the house where she would soon live. A big, beautiful home with a garden and a music room filled with instruments. Mila listened to everything with wide, wonder-filled eyes. She still couldn't believe this was her life now. She kept waiting for something to go wrong, for someone to tell her it was all a mistake. But that moment never came. On the day the adoption was finalized, Vincent arrived at the orphanage with a small gift wrapped in shiny paper. He handed it to Mila and told her to open it. Inside was a brand new music book. On the cover, written in gold letters, were the words, "Advanced Piano Songs." Vincent knelt down beside her and said that she had already mastered the beginner book. Now it was time to keep growing. Keep learning. Keep playing. Mila hugged the book to her chest and promised she would. Mrs. Holloway walked them to the door. She bent down and wrapped Mila in a long, tight hug. She whispered in her ear that she was so proud of her. That she always knew Mila was special. Even when Mila didn't believe it herself. Mila whispered back, "A thank you. A thank you for the music book. A thank you for the encouragement. A thank you for never giving up on her." Then she took Vincent's hand, and together, they walked out of the orphanage for the last time. 5 years passed. Mila was 15 now. She had grown taller, and her brown eyes sparkled with confidence and joy. The shy, quiet girl who used to sit alone by the window was gone. In her place was a young woman who walked with her head held high and a smile on her face. She still played the piano every single day. But now, instead of an old broken instrument in a dusty room, she played on a beautiful grand piano in the music room of her home. Her home, the words still felt magical to her. Vincent had kept his promise. He gave her lessons with the best teachers. He encouraged her to enter competitions. He sat in the front row at every recital, clapping louder than anyone else. But more than that, he gave her something she had longed for her whole life. A family. He wasn't just her adoptive father, he was her dad. The one who made her breakfast in the morning and helped her with homework at night. The one who told her silly jokes and watched movies with her on the weekends. The one who held her when she cried and celebrated with her when she succeeded. He taught her that family wasn't about blood. It was about love. It was about showing up. It was about choosing each other. Every single day. On the night of Mila's first professional recital, the concert hall was filled with hundreds of people. The lights were bright, and the air buzzed with excitement. Mila stood backstage, wearing a beautiful blue dress. Her hands trembled slightly, just like they had on that day at the orphanage 5 years ago. Vincent walked over to her and placed a hand on her shoulder. He looked into her eyes and smiled. He told her she was going to be amazing. He told her he was proud of her no matter what happened. He told her that her mother and his daughter were watching from somewhere above, cheering her on. Mila hugged him tightly and whispered that she loved him. Then she walked onto the stage. The audience fell silent as she sat down at the grand piano. The spotlight shone down on her, warm and golden. Before she played, she leaned into the microphone and spoke. She said this song was for her dad. The man who didn't give up on her. The man who taught her that family isn't about where you come from. It's about the people who never stop believing in you. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. The melody of Somewhere Over the Rainbow filled the concert hall. But this time, it wasn't shaky or uncertain. It was beautiful. It was flawless. It was filled with all the love and gratitude that Mila carried in her heart. Vincent sat in the front row, tears streaming down his face. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pure, overwhelming joy. He closed his eyes and listened. And in that moment, he could see them. His daughter, Lily, and Mila's mother, standing side by side, smiling down at the little girl who had found her way home. When the song ended, the audience rose to their feet. The applause was deafening. People cheered and wiped their eyes, but Mila didn't hear any of it. She was looking at her dad in the front row, and he was looking right back at her. No words were needed. Their eyes said everything. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for never giving up. Thank you for being my family. And in that moment, both of them knew that they had saved each other. Mila went on to become a world-famous pianist. She performed in concert halls across the globe and won awards that filled an entire room. But her greatest achievement wasn't any trophy or title. It was the music school she opened for orphaned children, a place where kids like her could learn to play, dream, and believe in themselves. She named it the Lily Foundation, in honor of the girl whose music book had changed her life forever. Because Mila never forgot where she came from, and she made sure that no child would ever feel invisible again.